Now I'd like to introduce our panelist for today's broadcast, Scott Aldsworth. Scott has more than 2 decades of experience in international business and finance. Scott is Radius's Vice President of Sales and helps companies achieve organizational objectives through international expansion. Scott's extensive background includes working in various finance and operations roles at 4 venture-backed startups. Scott also worked as Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions at Interliant, where he completed 28 acquisitions in just 3 years and helped get the company to its initial public offering. Prior to that, Scott held roles in finance and operations in several venture-backed companies, where he helped them to expand their presence globally. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Ed. Good afternoon, everybody. So just taking a quick look at today's agenda, we'll go through a common expansion scenario. So what do we usually see with our customers as they start to expand overseas? We'll talk about some permanent establishment issues and what our customers face as they start to look at set up entities overseas. We'll explore different revenue models, typically known as cost plus and direct revenue. We'll answer some very specific HR questions, and then talk about expats and global mobility. Lastly, we'll go through 10 best practices that Radius talks about with its customers. And we'll wrap up with Q&A. So, a common scenario. VP of Sales walks into the head of HR's office or a CFO's office with an offer letter for a new employee that they just hired in France. We see this happens all the time. Unfortunately, HR tends to be the last ones to find out, and so then they're faced with, how do I hire this employee? How am I going to pay them? Are they a contractor? Are they an employee? What types of contracts are required? What are my local employment requirements? And essentially, how am I going to handle this employee? How am I going to get them on board with our company and help them be productive and be a productive asset in France for my business? So the first thing that we ask our customers, what are you actually doing in country? What are the activities of the individuals on the ground, in this example, in France? Is it a sales and marketing operation? Is it an engineering operation? Is it software development? Are there individuals supporting specific customers overseas? The activities on the ground of the individual is really what's going to dictate what type of registration that you'll need in France. Will dictate the timeline, the costs, how long it's going to take to get set up, what are our compliance obligations, and how are we going to manage this overall business.
Thank you, Scott. And now we have time for our first polling question of the broadcast. There'll be 3 polls during the webinar today. We'll go ahead and launch the polling interface. What is the biggest challenge your organization faces expanding or operating overseas? Please use the polling panel on the side of your screen to cast your response. We'll leave the polls open for approximately 10 to 15 seconds to give everyone who cares to respond the opportunity to cast their vote. I'd like to thank the audience. I can see approximately 36% of the audience have already responded to today's poll. We'll go ahead and leave the polls open for approximately 5 more seconds to allow everybody else the opportunity to respond before we close the poll and share the results. It looks as though the majority of today's attendees have responded to poll number 1, so we'll go ahead and close the poll now and share the results. Scott, it looks like today's audience, 56% responded with compliance with local regulations as their top challenge, followed closely at 26% by entity setup considerations, and a trailing 11% at reducing tax liability and 7% at HR and employee benefits. We'll go ahead and hide the poll results now and return to our presentation.
Great. Thanks, Ed. So compliance and entity selection are two topics that we are going to cover today, so hopefully we'll get to answer a lot of people's questions. So the first issue, permanent establishment, you'll hear folks commonly refer to it as PE risk. And what this really boils down to is, do you need a legal entity in country? Again, it goes back to what are the activities on the ground that your employees are performing in a particular country. And what we're really asking here, right, is your business and the employees and their activities, is it creating a taxable presence for your business, in the case we talked about earlier, in France? There's a lot of questions that we'll need to ask and things that you'll need to understand in trying to evaluate that. The challenging piece is that it's different in every country. So whether or not you have a permanent establishment in the UK, and how you answer those questions will differ versus Brazil, versus China, versus Germany, versus France. But there's some common themes, and we can talk about some of those here. So number one, are you operating out of a fixed place of business? So essentially we're asking, do your employees work from home, or do they have a formal office place? Do people receive commissions? All right, so typically if you have a salesperson on the ground, they're receiving some sort of commission plan or bonus plan. And what that means is they're generating revenue in country. Right? Are they supporting customers? So perhaps you have a customer in France that has a contract with the U.S. business, but your employees are supporting that revenue generation in country. Are you selling directly to customers? So these are sort of all things that go into determining whether or not you have a permanent establishment in country. If you do have a permanent establishment, then typically you need to set up a subsidiary or a branch. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And essentially that taxable presence will allow you, and the subsidiary will allow you to pay taxes in country.